Hello, everyone, and welcome. All right, our presenters are going to take it from here, and I'll allow them to tell you a bit about themselves and the organization. So please join me in welcoming Joe Jensen, who's the VP of Church Engagement at Barna, as well as Nick Bogardus, VP of Marketing and Communications here at Subsplash. Hey, guys.
Hey, Chris. It's good to see everybody.
Good to see you all. Well, hey, I'll go first. I'm Joe Jensen, VP of Church Engagement of Barna. Before Barna, I was a full-time pastor, an executive pastor at a church in Omaha, and then before that at Christ Church of the Valley in Phoenix, Arizona. So I know exactly what you all are experiencing right now in this season of life and ministry. So we're excited to bring you some good insights today. Barna exists to serve you, the church, with research-driven insights and resources to help figure out these complex and changing times. We've especially devoted time in the last 18 months, a lot of time and energy to figuring out what's going on with this pandemic and where do we go from here. And so we're going to bring a few of those insights into today's webinar. Looking forward to our time today. And I've been just thrilled to be able to work with Nick over the past few months, discussing our heart for the church and how we can serve you all better.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. As Joe mentioned, I'm Nick Bogardus. I'm the VP of Marketing Communication here at Subsplash. I spent a little over a decade in the music industry, managing the careers of a few different artists. And then I spent 11 years in ministry where I planted two churches. One was the campus of a multi-site megachurch, and one was an independent Acts 29 church. And so I have some interesting experience on kind of the full spectrum of ministry in terms of church planting. But that said, I love bringing those two kind of halves of my life together, my career together, to help churches through the technology that Subsplash provides. As Joe mentioned, that background gives me a real kind of empathy and heart for what pastors are experiencing this last season. In fact, that one of the churches I planted had to close in COVID here in Orange County, California, because of the restrictions in the state and because of the realities of the pressures put upon us. And so for those of you who've gone through a really hard season, I'm with you, I feel you, and we are happy to be able to help you kind of turn and look forward and make the most of this end of the year. Subsplash makes software for churches that helps increase engagement, overcomes distraction, restores connections, and ultimately makes disciples. And so I'm happy to be here with you all today to talk about how we can do that through end of year giving.
Yeah, Nick, like I said, we started having conversations months ago, and really at the center of it was how can organizations come together, because we really have primarily the same purpose, and that is to serve the local church and her leaders, to equip them with everything that they need to disciple people more effectively. And so, Nick, this is kind of the culmination, and I'm hoping the beginning of a greater journey where we can serve the church together. Nick, why don't you open us up with prayer, and then we'll kind of kick things off.
I would love to. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for being a God who is lavish in grace, a God whose hand is over all that he has made. And God, I thank you that for each of these church leaders on this call, you know them. God, you have called them before the foundation of the world. You've chosen to rescue them. You've given your son Jesus to die for them. You've raised him from the dead to give them new life. And God, you've done all of that also for the people in our churches. Would you, God, remind us of your goodness this morning, of your sovereign providential hand over everything that you've given us to steward and lead. And would you help us to do that with courage and humility and excellence as we finish out this challenging year. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen, Nick. Well, hey, before we get into our content today, Nick and I want to present just a few resources that we want to make available to you all. I'm going to go first with Barna. We want to provide a free digital download at barna.com/subsplash. If you go there, you're going to find a free digital download of the entire Generosity Gap report. We did this research with Thrivent Financial. It's a Fortune 100 company who also exists in many ways to serve the church. And we came up with some great research-driven insights in this report, and we're going to make it free just to you today. That's a $30 report. That's absolutely free for you today. So go to barna.com/subsplash, and then there you're going to find some information about a 6-week cohort we're kicking off on accelerating generosity called Barna Collab. And I'm just really excited to be kicking that off next week. So I encourage you to go and check that out, because we're going to take 6 weeks in a really collaborative environment. We're going to dive into how we can accelerate generosity. We're going to be taking a deeper dive into year-end giving and activating non-givers, and how do we turn into 2022 and accelerate generosity in our churches so that the kingdom can be advanced through our ministries, so that disciples can be made, and generosity can be the fruit of that deeper discipleship. And so we're excited to bring you those resources. So again, go to barna.com/subsplash.
Thanks, Joe. On the Subsplash side, we have a free ebook for you. Through this webinar, you're going to hear some ways that the Subsplash platform can help you increase giving. And this ebook is a very practical, straightforward set of 11 tips that you can use to fuel and increase giving through the Subsplash platforms, to help you understand how to use features like giving and donor analytics, give from anywhere, and in-stream, live stream giving. And so you can go to subsplash.com/giving ebook to download that today and get started. Now, that said, we're going to jump into our content here. 30% of annual gifts to churches are donated in December. I imagine for those of you on this webinar, this is a stat that you are familiar with, and yet it's a moment where that kind of distant familiarity needs to kind of come forefront, because it has been a challenging year, and I'm thankful that we get to have time to kind of come together and reorient and start to look forward for how can we make plans for our churches and for our budgets for the next year. And so this is a good time to reorient around, we have an opportunity this quarter to finish this year strong and set up for ministry in 2022. Joe, would you walk us through these activities around generosity?
Yeah. And I appreciate, by the way, Nick, just with Barna, I love when we see stats. They don't have to be our stats for us to like them. I just want to say that, Nick. So it was funny because we were talking about that, and that stat it's just a really good centering stat for today's webinar. And really we want the content to really be guided by these principles. Okay, first of all, generosity isn't activated. Okay, it's cultivated, and that language is really important for us. Okay, and as pastors, I encourage you to lean into how you message, how you language, how you communicate generosity in your churches. Okay, the cultivation of generosity is important because it's really tied to this idea, first of all, that generosity doesn't happen by accident. Okay, cultivation takes time, it takes patience, it takes intentionality. And so it's really important. We want to really kick off with these principles because we really believe that these principles guide how we approach generosity, how we approach year-end giving. When we realize that year-end giving is actually not the end, even though it kind of communicates it in some ways, it's not the end, it's actually the beginning, or actually just part of the process of more of a lifelong pursuit of generosity as part of a discipleship journey for our people. And so again, it's not activated, it's cultivated. It doesn't happen by accident, it has to be intentional. And so we want to really center in to this idea that really at the end, it's all about discipleship. Now, Nick, I know that, like you said, your background, these aren't just kind of clever slides, clever slogans. Mm-hmm. This is like real life and real ministry. And you've actually lived this out to where generosity wasn't just something you do as a pastor. It's not just money that you raise. It's actually part of a discipleship journey.
Absolutely. And I think, Joe, the principles you just shared really tie into discipleship well, because at the end of the day, discipleship doesn't happen by accident, right? It has to be activated on a personal level. There are virtues and practices that we cultivate personally, but also as a church, it's a culture that we develop as a whole. And so giving is a part of that cultivating set of practices in discipleship. And so something we talk about at Subsplash is the discipleship journey. And it's helpful to look at this kind of all together, because something I want to put forward there is that it's not enough just to make volunteers, right? Though volunteers are necessary for helping the church to function, that's not enough. And we're not seeking just to make donors. That's not enough. We're actually seeking to make disciples. And so that's something I love about what I've seen of Subsplash in my time there the last 8 months, is that disciples are the goal of everything that Subsplash builds. And so this discipleship journey is something that we actually revisit in staff meetings, and we consider how are we, the tools that we're building, the features that we're providing, how do they support this discipleship journey? And so giving, you can see, is a part of that. It's you can't think of giving as an isolated activity. It's part of making disciples. And the thing is, most pastors are good at maybe a few of these things or a couple of these things. And so we tend to kind of elevate or emphasize them for our churches. And sometimes giving can be the awkward, uncomfortable one that we don't want to address, but you have to see it as a whole. And we have to address giving as a part of discipleship. And so something we talk about at Subsplash is donor discipleship. That's a term we use for intentional, discipleship-oriented approach to giving, not a pragmatic approach where you're just trying to cultivate donors to fund the organization, but actually you're trying to grow disciples who generously give of their time and their energy and their resources for the good of making more disciples and seeing people come to meet Jesus. And this donorship discipleship encourages non-givers to partner with your mission. It encourages infrequent givers to give regularly, and it encourages regular givers towards generosity and stewardship. And we believe that this is the winning strategy for shepherding your people along the discipleship journey so that they will joyfully partner with you in your mission and maximize your impact in this next year. And so we want to anchor everything that we're talking about in the paradigm of discipleship. And generosity here doesn't happen by accident, as we mentioned. If this is kind of like the survival information for our time together in this webinar, we want to make sure that you get, this has to be intentional. It has to be thoughtful. It has to be planned, and it doesn't happen by accident. As I mentioned a minute ago, generosity individually is a virtue that you cultivate. Within the church, it's a cultural issue that takes intentionality to cultivate. And so we can't put it off to the side. It has to be something we keep in front of us, being aware that it doesn't just happen by accident. And so in our time together, we're going to be looking at 3 mistakes that we want to avoid with year-end giving. And Joe's going to start us off by walking us through what these 3 mistakes are.
Yeah, first of all, Nick, I just want to say how much I appreciate your thoughts on that. And like I said before, when we approach these mistakes, I want to say a couple of things. One is, and I don't know about you, Nick, I've probably made one or all of these mistakes at a certain point in my ministry. Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
Here's the thing. We want to come with a spirit of grace here. And we want to come like actually just recognizing the fact that even though we may be making these mistakes currently, or maybe we've made them in the past, the whole spirit of this webinar is that these mistakes can be turned into opportunities. When we just recognize them and we work to avoid them, what we're going to see underneath the surface with all of these that Nick and I want to bring to the surface is the fact that there's great opportunity on the other side of these mistakes. And so for this first one, I know that this has been an issue in some of the churches I've served in, is misalignment is what happens when your vision, your leaders, and your congregation are on different pages when it comes to generous giving. Okay, so what we want to do is take a quick honest kind of inventory of this. Okay, and again, there's grace here, so just be honest. We're going to take a quick poll. To what extent are your vision, leaders, and congregation aligned on giving? So just take a quick, quick inventory. Look at kind of the major programs, the major initiatives, the way you communicate with your people, the way your people communicate with you. And just ask yourself, to what extent are your vision, leaders, and congregation aligned on giving? So completely not aligned, mostly not aligned, somewhat aligned, mostly aligned, completely aligned, or maybe you're just like, I don't know. That's why I'm here. I'm trying to figure some things out. So let's take a few seconds and answer this poll. As you do, Nick, I'm just going to throw it to you real quick because I was transparent just now. Okay, I was vulnerable. Yeah. I've made this mistake. Yeah. Nick, how about you?
Oh, completely. money can be one of those very difficult topics to talk about, and especially even from a leadership perspective, being honest about budgets, being honest about needs, and being vulnerable, like you just mentioned, Joe, is a challenge. And so, yes, I have certainly made my own pile of mistakes on this topic. And so I appreciate you leading in that vulnerability. It's interesting to see these poll results coming in. Chris, what are we showing?
Well, here's what everybody said. It looks like most people here are in the middle, between feeling somewhat aligned kind of there or mostly aligned, which is for one, an encouraging spot to be. Also, I think that Nick, you and Joe can both have a lot of insights as far as getting people closer to that completely aligned spot where only looks like 3 folks are sitting right now. So yeah. Joe, how do we get there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's what we're all here to kind of figure out. I would say, as we go to our data, and we love to do this in a lot of our data, we like to ask pastors the same question that we ask Christians. And then we like to kind of see where we're at. And a lot of times when we do this type of research, this misalignment can be revealed, okay? So when you look at, this question of kind of generosity is always blank, and we gave them a few different responses to choose from, okay? Generosity is always a response to Christ's love, an attitude, a discipline, sacrificial, driven by compassion, planned, driven by duty, or spur of the moment, right? And of course, like pastors are going to say, generosity is always a response to Christ's love. Now, the good news is that almost half of all Christians would say that too, that it's always a response to Christ's love. But as you look down here, you're going to start to see where some of this misalignment happens, right? Where there's a 20-point difference between how pastors are answering some of these and how Christians are. Now, sometimes I don't want us to overreact and over-respond to this, but it's really just a perspective shift for us to say, okay, the way us pastors a lot of times look at things like generosity can be slightly different or vastly different from how the people in our congregation are looking at these things. I want to bring note to the fact that, generosity is always driven by compassion. 40% of all Christians said that, and only 30% said generosity. And then down, look at the bottom, and these numbers may seem small, but I think they're pretty significant. Only 2% of pastors say that generosity is always spur of the moment, and 11% of all Christians say generosity is always spur of the moment. And go to the next slide, because we dive a little bit deeper into the spur of the moment thing. And if you look at this, even down by generation, you're going to see that the younger generation looks at generosity as a spur of the moment more than elders do and more than pastors do. And so I really want to call our attention to the fact that even generationally, there can be misalignment when we're not looking at how the younger generations are viewing generosity. We have to look at generosity as intentional, but how do we also tap into the fact that a lot of younger generations also want to look at generosity as something they kind of do spur of the moment. Now, sometimes we think of spur of the moment as like this reckless generosity. Actually, a lot of the younger generations tell us that actually spur of the moment means that they want generosity to be part of all of life. That whole life discipleship produces spontaneous, generous moments and opportunities in their life. And so I would just encourage us to look at this and say, out of all of these things, and by the way, all of this is in that free download. And by the way, I've seen in the chat, we have a few issues with some of the Barna.com downloads. We're going to get that fixed and we'll get you your free report. But all of this, you can take a deeper dive into that. What I encourage you to do is look at where are we misaligned in our church when it comes to how we view generosity. And pastors, we got to get honest with ourselves to say, hey, maybe we've kind of relied on a certain understanding of generosity and where it comes from and what it's about. And we need to kind of stop and say, okay, what does the Bible tell us? And what are our people telling us about how generosity is a part of this whole life discipleship pursuit? Nick, you've got some really good practical advice for how we can get aligned with our people.
Well, as I look at this slide, Joe, would you mind going back one slide, Chris? It makes me super thankful for what you and Barna do. When I was leading churches, Barna was the partner I looked to, like the friend I called when I was trying to figure something out and I couldn't make sense of it. And when you see something like this, you see data like this, it can be so helpful for church leaders to kind of cut through our assumptions, right? Kind of what you were just mentioning, Joe, that we assume giving looks a particular way because it's what we've experienced or it's the way that we've always done it. And when we see information like this, it causes us to kind of stop for a moment and go, wait a second, actually, does it have to look like this? Can it look a little differently? Are our expectations appropriate for ourselves and for the church, for all groups of the church? It helps us see, like you mentioned, how can we connect with groups in the church, some of these younger folks who are looking for a different kind of interaction with generosity compared to some of the older folks in the church that might have a different way of doing it. It helps us broaden challenge our assumptions, broaden our expectations, and be realistic and more effective, I think. And so I'm thankful that you and Barna provide insights like this for church leaders. And I'm sure this is helpful for those who are on this webinar. As far as practical steps, we can go to the next slide there. For getting aligned, first, I would say align your vision around discipleship. I think starting from the place of giving them a vision of a gospel-centered, generous God. Like as the church leader, if you are one of the primary communicators, are you giving them a vision of a God who takes sin seriously, has given his son to die for them, but is also lavish in his love and provision for his kids? Like, do they see the kind of abundance mindset that comes from being a child of God? And I don't mean that in some kind of like prosperity gospel way. I mean that in a good, reformed, like joyful, I'm an adopted son of the king way. But do you give them that vision of who God is and what he is like that might challenge some of their own fears around possessions and money, and might challenge some of their views of material reality, that there's more beyond this life, and so what they have can be used to steward for greater kingdom purposes? And so I think even starting from that place of that discipleship paradigm, helping them see God in a big and good and loving way can really be helpful for helping people look at their money a little differently in a way that challenges the assumptions and the expectations that the world puts on them. But I think there's also something you can do, because we have a bullet point there that says keep the focus on real life impact. And what I would highlight there, something that I've seen be very helpful, is that there are people in your church who are being generous in ordinary ways. They are disciples of Jesus who are not doing extraordinary news-making acts of generosity. They are simply doing the ordinary day-to-day life of disciples who are a part of a local church. And you want to highlight those, right? You want to highlight, like, for example, our church here in Orange County, California, Cross of Christ, we partnered with the school that we met in to get bags for single moms, right? We would put together bags for moms who were limited in resources, didn't have a lot of support, and we would just bring them supplies for their kids. They were teenage moms, right? Like we did the best we could to provide support for them. When COVID first hit, we put together a care team that put together COVID care boxes to meet the needs of those who were isolated in quarantine. We had community group funds. And so each community group, each small group, maybe some of you on this webinar do this. And if you do, I'd love to hear about it in the chat. But we had a fund in the church that gave basically micro grants to community groups who, if someone in the group, their oven broke, or we actually had an incident where someone's kitchen burned down. Their community group raised money, the church matched it to try to help get this family back on their feet. There are ordinary things happening in your church around generosity, and you can create structures and processes for those, but you can highlight them on Sundays, in your newsletters, wherever is best to communicate them. So align your vision around discipleship and keep the focus on real life impact. If you're ever going to talk about giving, I would say always show the impact of it. Next, align your leadership team. And what that looks like, this is a leadership team who knows why you give as a church. They know how you give as a church, and they are actively giving themselves. In my work through the church networks that we were a part of, in some of the consulting work I've done for churches, I've seen instances where leadership teams and elder teams in a church, they're actually not all giving. And it's hard to expect a leadership team who isn't giving to then lead a generous church. The generosity starts with a leadership team. They have to lead by that example. And so I think that's a significant part of assessing the health and leading practically the leadership team that is over your church. And then lastly, aligning your community, normalizing the giving conversation in the church. And this involves stripping the stigma of giving in churches. Because yes, we have seen the abuse of finances in churches. We don't want to minimize that many of us have experienced or at least heard of bad stories about how churches have stewarded their finances. But we can all provide positive stories, can't we? We can provide great examples of what it can look like to use the resources God has given us for the good of our churches and our communities. And so here's a couple practical tips on how to do this. Have rhythms of family updates. I've seen this be very effective. Every single month, we would give an update to our church about how we're doing financially, what's happening in our ministries. And that created an opportunity every single month where the church knew we're going to talk about finances. And so I got to be really clear about how are we doing in reality and what do we actually need? And it gives you an opportunity to have some clear calls to action, sign up for a group and give, right? It gives you an opportunity to tell stories about what's happening in the church and have people share about what God is doing in the life of the church. But these rhythms of monthly family updates give you an opportunity to align your community with a generous culture. And then there's stories of generosity that provided this church as a place for new people. We have all seen reshuffling in the last year. There are new people in your church, and it's helpful to help them connect the dots of they are here and there's a place for them to be and worship Jesus and a community for them to come into because people before them have been generous. Help them see that kind of that legacy that has created this place for there to be a church that exists for them to welcome them in if they've moved to a new city or they just needed a new local church. So tell those stories as well of past generosity. So those are three really practical ways to get your church and your leadership team aligned around generosity. There's 3 steps that you could take today, really practically, and that is to open your mobile app and website and ask, what do they communicate about how our church views giving? I would imagine if your church website is alike, most church websites, there are some, very good and true Bible verses around giving on your giving page. But do you also have stories of the impact of that giving? Do you also have ways that people can give right there on the page? Like, look at what your giving platform says about why you give and the impact of it. You can also, before the end of the year, schedule a meeting with your leadership team and get aligned on your vision for generous giving. Bring your leadership team on board with you. Bring them in as advocates for you, as ambassadors in the church for cultivating this generous culture within the whole body. And then thirdly, start building a plan to be even more intentional about discipling towards greater generosity in 22. Again, it doesn't happen by accident, right? You have to put dates on the calendar. If you have your sermon series planned out for the whole year, like you should probably think about am I gonna have so many sermons on giving? How are we gonna talk about this in community groups, so on and so forth. So be intentional about putting some things on a calendar. Now let's talk about our second mistake, Joe. We're going to start looking at some misinformation. Is that right?
Yeah, misinformation is what happens when decisions are made or assumptions are maintained without the right relevant data. Now, this resonates with me, not just because I work at Barna, and this is something we're trying to help the church with, is bringing the right data and the right information. But really as a pastor, I mean, there was so often, with so much information hitting us. I mean, we live in an information overload world, right? And with all the information coming to us from social media and other sources, and you got to imagine that for us as pastors, that's a reality. And for our congregants, that's a reality. And so what happens is you have misinformation. It's kind of like this sneaky thing that sneaks in the back door and can wreak havoc on our leadership. So this mistake number 2, misinformation is what happens when decisions are made or assumptions are maintained without the right relevant data. Quick question, and you don't have to say this in the chat or anything, but just, I'm throwing this out there. Have you ever made a decision or have you ever put a ministry plan into place and you got down and it kind of failed miserably? For me, I've done that. where we've tried something, we've taken a risk, and then you go back and you kind of figure out, okay, what happened there? Why did that fail? Why did that not work the way we thought? For me, a lot of times when I've gone through that process, it's actually an assumption that I made at a certain part in that leadership journey, in that decision-making process. And that assumption is what set us off on a trajectory that ended up not being the right decision that was made, not necessarily because of the decision itself, but because of the assumption that the decision was built upon. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to generosity and how we disciple our people in and out of generosity, misinformation, it's really important that we try to avoid this mistake. Now, I want to share with you some data from Generosity Gap that talks a little bit about this in a certain way. So we asked, the most generous things a person can do. Now, respondents could choose up to 3 of these. So if you look at these, taking care of someone who is sick, I'm not going to read all these, by the way, but I'll read some of the big ones. Volunteering for an organization, signing up to be an organ donor. Okay, those are the top responses for what a generous thing a person can do. Okay, now if you look down the list, you have giving $40 to a homeless person, and then way down the list is giving $40 in offering to a church. Now, I just want you to sit and look at these things, right? Now, if you look at all of these things in and by itself, you're like, okay, I can see generosity pouring through all of those actions. You look at some of these, like, okay, that makes sense. But what, as a former pastor, what I look at is like, my assumption is that the most generous thing somebody can do, and how they view the most generous thing that they can do, is to give to the church, because I'm making assumptions that they already know that being a disciple means giving money to the church to fund the ministry. And we just reduce giving to certain things based on an assumption that had maybe for years or maybe has never been challenged by us internally. And so we automatically preach sermons, build communication plans, build discipleship ministries based on assumptions that need to be challenged. Okay, now, does giving $40 to a church, is that a bad thing? Does not constitute generosity just because people say it doesn't? No, that's not it at all. We believe that giving to the church and to the kingdom is one of the most generous things that you can do. But there's a generosity gap, which is the whole purpose of that report, is to reveal some of these gaps. And what we have to do is not assume that everyone is where we're at. And we have to, a part of the discipleship journey is we have to meet them where they're at to bring them where they need to be. So if you go to this next slide, there's a little bit of a different way of looking at the same topic, okay? If you look at the most important reason for Christians to be generous, okay? So this is getting more to like motivations, which is really important. Pastors say, to reflect God's character by showing love to others, okay? Seems like a noble reason in pursuit of generosity, right? But you'll see, especially with Gen Xers, that's a little bit lower, okay? So it's something to consider and look at. To give back in appreciation for God's generosity towards us. Now, for me, I've given a lot of preach sermons and, give offering meditations and things. And that's one of the things I always used, right? And maybe many of you say, we're going to give back to God what he's given to us. Now, we see that elders resonate with that, but we have to look at maybe some of the younger generations and say, okay, does that resonate with them? Is that going to motivate them to give? Okay, why or why not? So these are a lot of questions. I'm not going to give you a ton of conclusions. I want to give you the data and have you really reflect on these things. What can we learn from this? What assumptions do these reveal that we need to challenge? Okay, what misinformation have we been given about where we think our people are at when it comes to their motivations, their thoughts, how they view generosity, and how can we close that gap between where they're at and where they need to be? And that's part of what it means for us to be shepherds and to be disciple makers, is we need to consider where they're at, walk with them, shepherd them towards a more holistic view and a healthier view of what generosity it is. And I think this is so important for us as we enter the year-end period. Okay, because year end is not just about us cashing in this moment, right? To just get people to give out of what they've been given. This is an opportunity to see this as a small part of a bigger journey of discipleship. And so we need to be careful that we check our assumptions and that we communicate accurately and holistically about where year-end giving comes in the greater discipleship journey. So Nick, again, I love the fact that you've had to look at these types of statistics as a pastor. So I'd love for you to kind of chime in here. What are your thoughts on some of these stats I just chimed in on?
I'm sure the generosity gap has some of the implications of these that are far more articulate than I can be just kind of riffing on the slide right now. But just what you're pointing out in terms of expectations and the difference between how pastors might view something and congregants might. I mean, I would call it on this slide right here. Look at the top one, reflecting God's character. 42% of pastors view that as a significant reason for giving. But then look at the disparity between how Gen Xers and pastors view that, or millennials and pastors. That means that when you lead from that place, which is a good and right place to lead it, you might be assuming that they're picking it up, right? Like you might be assuming they're catching on to that. And this would show that that's not true. So you have to figure out how would I communicate that in a way that anchors giving in that ultimately true and good principle, but how can I help them catch that a little more? Or even on the one to the right of it, this one was interesting to me, to show faith and trust in God to provide for our needs, that pastors view that from the lowest place as like an important reason, but other people view it as a more important reason. So that might indicate that some congregants might view giving as more of a risky endeavor than pastors might, right? Like they view it as an expression of risk. Like I'm going to give, and I know that God will still catch me, even if it's a little risky for me. And so that's something to see there, that maybe there's a place to lead from emphasizing that part of it as well. So again, like super thankful for Joe, what you and Barna provide. This is great. And again, helping us challenge our assumptions and set some good expectations here.
No, those are great thoughts, Nick. I appreciate that. And really, this leads to this ultimate question: how can you reach your people if you don't know your people? And really, the purpose of research is to not just reveal flaws or mistakes. It's really to point us to like where people are actually at, so that we can stop making decisions based on assumptions, and we can base it on our knowledge of where people are at. Again, with that principle of discipleship, that our job as shepherds is to bring people where they're at to where they need to be in Christ. And so that a part of that shepherding process is this idea of knowing your people. So we gave you a big, broad view, but I would say as you're talking to people, ask them these questions and then truly listen and lean in and let that inform the way you disciple your people in generosity. Hey, Nick, you have, again, I've appreciated the fact that Subsplash actually brings some hard stats to this conversation too. So what are you seeing from your Subsplash data when it comes to this?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So we have 14,000 churches on our platform. And when we look across all of those churches who use our giving, these are two stats that I think are worthy of highlighting. The first is that 34% of donors have set up recurring gifts, and 37% of donors are covering fees for the church. And again, these are across all churches on the platform. These are what we see as an average of 34% and 37%. And now these are two great stats to look at in terms of financial sustainability, because the first one about recurring gifts sets a kind of a foundation of stability for you as a church leader, because if people are giving in a recurring way, it's obviously an easier way for them to give, but it's also a way for you to plan your budget. Like if you know that every month there is this amount of recurring giving, it helps you kind of have a foundation for setting maybe some ministry budgets or line item expenses, stuff like that. It gives you at least a foundation of stability. And so, I mean, ideally, you'd probably want to see that go up if possible to kind of continue that kind of baseline stability. But that second one, the 37% of donors covering fees, and I'm going to get to this in the next slide, but this is important because this gives you more margin. If you are having to cover the fees, that means out of your church budget, out of what's given to you, you're paying companies who have no interest in your mission, in the health of your church. You're paying them fees just to facilitate the giving. And so if the donors are covering that, that means more comes back to the church. And so if you can encourage more people who are donating to your church to cover those fees, that can be really, really helpful for providing more margin for your church. And so let's talk about getting informed. You're going to want to start by looking at your giving analytics, thinking about some metrics that matter. And I would imagine that those of you who are watching the webinar, there's a lot of browser clicking right now, tabs opening for looking at your dashboard. You should be looking for some particular analytics. Something that was always helpful for me, again, viewing this through the lens of discipleship. What percentage of my church is giving? What percentage of our members are giving? What percentage of our leaders, small group leaders? That helps you get a sense of like, how are people doing really, like in terms of discipleship and health and financial resources? Like, how are they actually doing? That creates for some good conversations around like maybe challenging some things, but also maybe there's some needs that people are hesitant to express that you can help meet. And so that metric, what percent of the church is giving, is one that can be very important for you. You're probably going to have an executive pastor or a very analytically gifted deacon run those kind of numbers for you, but you can pull those from your dashboard. You're going to want to look at ACH gifts, donor covered fees, recurring gifts, the average gift amount. These should all be in your dashboard. And these are important metrics to keep an eye on. And the giving provider that you use, if it's not Subsplash, should provide these kind of metrics to help you give you insight for the giving health of your church. The second is to know your effective rate. And this is incredibly important because here's the thing. If you are paying more than 3% in fees, you are likely overpaying. And this is one of those places where other giving platforms kind of get you. They don't include this in their fine print. It's not upfront. It's kind of hidden. But you're going to want to find what is the actual rate that you are paying in fees. Because if it's over 3%, you're absolutely overpaying. Something I've loved since coming to Subsplash is hearing the heart of our founder, Tim, and our leadership team for doing everything possible to serve and grow and help local churches make an impact. For example, the way that Subsplash has negotiated their fees with some of our providers has saved churches on our platform $21 million in fees. $21 million we've saved churches. We've also, through our Grow Curve program, given back over $2.5 million. That's $2.5 million that would have come to Subsplash to help support our business that actually we send back to local churches. The more that people give to your church, the more that comes back through that program. And so even through the giving back of fees, saving churches $21 million, and our Grow Curve program, Subsplash is a company that has put their money where their mouth is. And so you're going to want to find that effective rate, and you're going to figure out if you're overpaying for that. And if you don't know, you can very easily at subsplash.com schedule a call with one of our ministry consultants or our client success managers. And we actually have an effective rate calculator that will help you see how much you can save if you're overpaying today. You can do that at subsplash.com. And then finally, you can decide which metrics matter most to you. And there's a whole list of things that you're going to want to consider there in terms of savings and rates and your giving method breakdown, your median gift amount, all of those. But you're going to want to get with your leadership team and figure out, based on where we're headed as a church, what initiatives might be ahead of us. What do we want to keep an eye on in terms of giving so we can make sure that we're making the most impact and taking the limited resources that we have as far as possible? So these are three ways that you can get informed today. And so we'd love to help with that at Subsplash. Mistake number three is
Nick and Joe. I'm going to jump in real quick just to acknowledge we're at the hitting close to the end of our scheduled time, but cool. Nick and Joe do have that last mistake to walk through. So I want to make sure that if you have the time, please do stick with us. And they're also going to be available for some Q&A at the end. So Nick, go ahead and take it away. Let's hear what our third mistake is.
Thanks.
For preachers, that's what happens, right, Nick? We go along.
Yeah. Give a pastor a mic and see what happens. But yes, third mistake, and I am looking forward to some Q&A. And if you guys in the chat have any best practices that you've learned and lessons you've learned and want to share them in the chat, it would be great just for the community that's gathered here watching this to learn from each other as well. So go ahead and throw those in there. Third mistake is missed opportunities. Missed opportunities are strategies within your overall plan that aren't being leveraged to their full potential or not at all. And so we want to see here that there are 3 opportunities for you to consider today. The first is digital giving. Everybody around the world has a cell phone these days. And so being able to give through their phone to remove the friction of having to go anywhere else to do that actually is one of your biggest opportunities to have a secure and convenient way for your donors to give to your church or your ministry is a significant opportunity. If you don't have that, that would be something I would tackle today. The next is your next generation givers. Millennials are about to inherit the biggest wealth transfer in modern times from their parents. And that is an absolutely true stat. But let me kind of add another maybe layer to this that I've seen be really helpful. Most of us, I'm guessing the majority of us, have seen our churches reshuffled, right? Like in California here, the exodus is real. I can't tell you how many people we know who have moved out of state. There are actually mega churches in California that are planting campuses in other states where Californians are moving because so many are leaving. There's so many people shuffling around. And so your church likely has had people come and go. Now, something that I kind of stumbled upon by accident was, remember that stat at the beginning of the webinar? 30% of churches' budgets are given at the end of the year. I started to see as a pastor, some of our largest gifts were coming from people who had left the church. They had moved somewhere else, but they were so thankful for their time at our church. And they were so impacted by the discipleship of our church. They continued to want to support it. And so I started to see that, and I started to kind of create almost an alumni network. Like if I disciple people really well, and if our church loves them really well, and they continue to believe in the mission of our church here in Orange County, they may still continue to give to it and want to support it. And so that could be something you consider doing. Is like, if you've seen a lot of people come and go, think about, well, there are probably people who are out there who have left who still want to support what we're doing here. And so don't miss that opportunity. That could be something really practical that you do. And thirdly is non-givers, knowing why they don't give so you know how to engage them, especially millennials. Again, I think, there's a lot of challenges the church is facing. And one of them is just like an onslaught of negative stories, that some of which are true, and we have to acknowledge those. And I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging those. We can, as the church who believes in a gracious and good God who takes sin seriously and who still loves us, we can be honest about our flaws, 100%. But there's a lot of that may be hyperbolic and may not be accurate. And so you can tell a better story, and you can tell a truer story about the impact of generosity in your church on the lives of people in your church and in your community. And so when you know why people may be hesitant to give, you can be honest about it, but you can also help them see the reality of the impact of giving. And so those are 3 big opportunities that you have. Now, Joe, you have some more helpful stats here in terms of how people view their finances.
Yeah. And before I get to those, I want to just highlight a couple of things because I think what you just shared is really practical. And I would say, like, especially with non-givers and next gen givers, there's a couple just things I want to add to what Nick said really quickly. One is, what if you looked at the year-end giving not as the end of the year or end of something, but the beginning of something. Okay, awesome. And communicate that really clearly. And that goes to my second point, which is be careful not to just communicate year-end giving as a meet the budget type of endeavor, okay? Inspire them beyond that. Inspire them beyond just like, hey, we got to meet the budget. We got to pay the bills. We want to finish the year in the black. I mean, I've heard all those. I've said all those. But really, it's like inspire them beyond that. Especially when you tie those 2 principles together, what you see is that this can be the beginning of 2022. It can be the beginning of a journey for the next 12 months. It's not just the end of 2021 and the culmination of a year. It can be the beginning of a whole new year where generosity is the first fruit of their journey, not the last fruit Okay.
Absolutely.
And so that brings me to, if we're going to really inspire people to give, coming out of a whole life discipleship mentality, we have to kind of look at some real stats here. So if you go to this statistic, the ultimate financial goal for life by generation, check this out. Okay, providing for our family. So it's really pragmatic. 22% of all Christians, 31% of millennials. Just mark that one. That's significant. Okay, millennials are in a stage of life where the real present everyday reality is that they got to provide for their families. Okay, but if you go down this list, look at number 6, serve God with my money. Okay, 10% of all Christians say that the ultimate financial goal for life is to serve God with my money. Okay, now there's a lot that goes into that. What does that mean to serve God with your money? Here's what I want you to take away. There's an opportunity to, again, communicate generosity and giving as a whole life discipleship pursuit. So if you go to the next slide, you're going to see a different expression of that. So the types of actions that are strongly associated with giving. So again, service, emotional support, those come above money. So again, we especially see with the younger generations that there is this desire that generosity, and specifically giving money. Now, it's not unimportant, but what they're saying is that they want to see money and the giving of money as a means and as a part of a bigger journey for them. Okay. Now, part of that journey is very pragmatic, very practical, very embedded in real life challenges. And then part of it's like aspirational and I would say spiritual. And what they want to do is bring those things together. They don't want a pastor to silo the spiritual pursuit of generosity and giving and their whole life, Monday through Saturday. They want a more integrated, holistic approach. And then if you go to this last slide here, people consider their preferred acts of generosity to be most generous. So you can kind of look at this, like which type of giving do you personally see as most strongly associated with generosity, kind of crossed up with in what way are you most generous to others? And you're going to start to see, we've highlighted this in the darker colors, right? Monetary support, so the percentage of money is the lowest of those. Emotional, relational support, giving of gifts, hospitality, service, those are all put above money. Now, that shouldn't discourage us when it comes to year-end giving. It should awaken us to this reality that when we approach year-end giving, we need to approach it, we need to inspire them and disciple them really with this idea that your year-end gift is actually not just there to kind of put you in the black as a church or pay the bills or to meet the budget. It's the beginning of this holistic journey that your ability to give emotionally and relationally to people, your ability to be hospitable and to serve your community and to serve your family and your friends, and then to serve them and to serve the church and the kingdom, and ultimately to give to God with your money is all integrated. So I'd really encourage you to really check your messaging, check your preaching, make sure that you're tying all of these things together with a holistic discipleship approach. So here's a poll to kind of end things. What's the number one missed opportunity for your church to take advantage of today? So we're going to throw that poll up really quickly. So take about 30 seconds to a minute. What's the number one missed opportunity for your church to take advantage of today? Digital giving, next gen givers, or non-givers?
Yeah, for those of you saying non-givers, again, in the kind of great reshuffling, some data that we're starting to look at is the length of time it takes for someone to start giving once they've kind of changed churches, right? Martin Luther had that kind of funny quote that there's 3 conversions in the Christian life: the mind, the heart, and the wallet. People tend to get settled first relationally, and then they may give down the line. And we're hearing numbers anywhere from 6 months to 18 months, and so it wouldn't surprise me to see non-givers being the highest opportunity here. Is that what we're seeing in the poll, Chris?
Yep. Yep, that's what we just saw. That non-givers was the number one answer there. And I would say, just to end, we want to answer a couple questions. And I know Chris is pushing us to do that. Sorry, Chris, we're pushing up on time here. But I would say just real quickly, Nick, I'll just probably speak for both of us. We want to reiterate the fact, and we apologize for some of the technical issues. I'm going to put an email in, just an info email for Barna. If you, for some reason, had issues downloading your free copy of Generosity Gap, just email us, and maybe Subsplash, we can do the same thing. But yeah, we want to just give away those free resources to you. So check those out, and we'll put those links in the chat for you as we close. But let's, Nick, I think we have time for a couple questions. So Chris, why don't you kind of lead us through highlighting questions that we can answer.
I would love to. We've had a number of questions come in, a number we've been able to answer just as typing here in the background. But let me read some of those that came in for you guys. The first one I'll ask here is, what tips do you have for storytelling around generosity that don't appear in such a way as to exploit the recipients of those stories or the recipients of the giving? How do you tell stories without tending towards some kind of exploitation?
That's a good question. Well, I think exploitation, I would kind of equate with manipulation, right? And so if you're just telling the true story, I think you kind of spare yourself from that risk. I think also the hero of the story, this is a big one. That's something that our team talks about a good amount, right? If you're telling the story of generosity in your church, and you are the hero, or even the church is the hero, that certainly could be exploitative. If Jesus is the hero, if the group of people who gathered around to help meet this need are the hero, I think you could be on the right path for sure. That could spare you from some of that exploitation.
Yeah, and hey, real quick, one other thing I'd add to that is tell generosity stories outside of generosity moments. Okay.
Yeah.
Because people are going to sniff that out. If you're going to be talking about giving and then you tell a story, what I would say is, like, just tell stories of life change. And then when you're interviewing somebody, whether it's live or on video, ask them a question about it, but as a part of their whole discipleship journey. And then when you tell that story outside of the conventional moments where you're kind of quote unquote asking for the offering. Okay, so that's one practical thing. And then the next thing too is just let them tell their story. Okay, just get out of the way, ask them good questions, let them tell their story, because when it comes out of their mouth from their heart, it's more powerful. And as long as you're not coaching them too much, get out of the way, ask good questions, and let them tell their story.
Yeah. I think that's where that rhythm kind of like, I think that's where that rhythm of regular kind of updates with the church or moments where you can tell stories enables you to do that in a way that's not forced. Like it's just part of the rhythm and the culture of the church. Sorry. Thanks, Chris.
Absolutely. Yeah. The next question here, really similar actually. What's a good way to capture these stories? Heidi mentioned that they have hundreds of small groups, so it's just a lot of data to try to bring into one place. How do you capture those stories?
Well, a couple of things that we've done in the past is just a really quick Google form on the website, www.yourchurch.com/story or something like that, as a way to just capture those. And then we kind of kept track of those really well. And as a team, we would actually kind of collect those stories each week, and we would say, okay, how can we, in a pure way, tell these people's stories? And so we actually then had to put a planning rhythm in place to be able to pray through those stories, discern which stories can be shared in which moments. And then the third thing is equipping your small group leaders with the mentality and the ability to collect those stories yourself in a way to report them back to you. Because you're going to hear a lot, people through prayer requests at the end of a small group or through after small group discussions, create a mechanism. And again, that mechanism was that website, and a small group leader could go and collect those stories as well. And then again, those get kind of fed into a spreadsheet. We prayerfully considered how we would tell those stories.
Yeah. A particular example, if your church does any kind of micro grants through the community, having one of the prerequisites of having them give a report of how did it go, what was the need that you met, how was the money spent, stuff like that can be a helpful channel for that to come from. But to Joe's answer, I think it requires a process, and it actually kind of requires someone to man the process. So I've seen it really effectively done where, if you take attendance in your small groups, depending on what kind of feedback mechanism you have for that, you can build a question into that form that's like, hey, do you have any updates to share from group this week that the elders or pastors may want to know about? Or you have like a form that when they fill out any kind of like, serving day or anything like that, there's a story kind of field in there as well. Like if they're going to go serve the city in some way, there's some feedback form for that. So like just being really intentional with those processes, but then having someone who can help ensure those forms are filled out and then followed up on when they are. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Joe. Hey, we are at time, so let's go ahead and wrap it here. I know that if there are any unanswered questions, that both the team at Barna and at Subsplash would love to walk those out with you. So there will be plenty of opportunities to get connected with us through email follow-ups to the webinar. We'll be sending out the recording later today and provide some pathways for you to get connected and ask those questions if you'd like to. I'll leave this here just as a final note for where you can take some next steps with Subsplash Giving and also with the Barna collab. So please do check those out. And once again, you'll see the webinar recording later today. Joe, Nick, anything else from you two? It's been a pleasure picking your brain for the last hour.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks. It was such a privilege to be able to serve the church, and we're praying for you. We're in your corner, especially in these tough times as you go to year-end giving. I just pray for abundance, and that comes from this internal journey and overflow of just good old-fashioned discipleship. So that's what we're praying for all of you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure being with you all today. Joe, it's great getting to work with you on this for that past month. I'm excited for more of them in the future. Church leaders, we love you. Subsplash loves you. I know Barna does. And so we're happy to help. Feel free to reach out at subsplash.com/giving, and we'd love to help you get set up with some giving solutions that could help support the impact that you're having through your church.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Take care. Have a good one.